أشهد أن محمد رسول الله.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
وأقسموا بالله جهد أيمانهم لئن أمرتهم ليخرجن قل لا تقسموا طاعة معروفة إن الله خبير بما تعملون. قل أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول فإن تولوا فإنما عليه ما حمل وعليكم ما حملتم وإن تطيعوه تهتدوا وما على الرسول إلا البلاغ المبين. وعد الله الذين آمنوا منكم وعملوا الصالحات ليستخلفنهم في الأرض كما استخلف الذين من قبلهم وليمكنن لهم دينهم الذي ارتضى لهم وليبدلنهم بعد خوفهم أمنا يعبدونني لا يشركون بي شيئا ومن كفر بعد ذلك فأولئك هم الفاسقون. وأقيموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأطيعوا الرسول لعلكم ترحمون. لا تحسبن الذين كفروا معجزين في الأرض ومأواهم النار ولبئس المصير.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Firstly, just wanted to thank the masjid for inviting me to share a few words with you all. In particular, I wanted to thank Brother Zakaria who invited me and organised this event, and also to thank you for attending, of course, and for waiting for us in setting this up, so apologies for the slight delay. Before we get into the topic of discussing Taariq bin Ziyaad, just wanted to discuss a few issues pertaining to the issue of history itself and the importance of history, because of course what we are discussing today, of course, is a historical event and a historical matter. Now, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, it is said that one of the first places that was attacked and destroyed by the US Army was, of course, the libraries and the museums. Now, these buildings contained many manuscripts and artifacts from previous periods of Iraq, from Mesopotamia, from Assyria, Sumeria, and of course from the great Islamic civilizations themselves. And an Iraqi archaeologist was interviewed at the time, and the Iraqi archaeologist said that if a country's identity, its values, and its civilizations is rooted in its history. If any country's civilization is rooted like ours has been, then of course we lose our history. And it's a very important point that the archaeologists have made, because if we don't know our history, then anyone can sell us by deception their own image and narrative of the past, and in doing so also sell us their dream of the future as well. And I would say that a people who don't know their history are akin to someone who suffers from Alzheimer's disease. And of course, we know someone who suffers from Alzheimer's disease is someone who is forgetful and doesn't know what took place before. And of course, such a person is vulnerable and can be exploited by other people. And we can tie this in fact, to recent matters. So if you think about just a month or two ago when we had in November the Remembrance Day of the World Wars. And of course, we've seen over the last few years there's been a really big push by the government, by the media, and unfortunately by some Muslim organisations as well, to discuss and portray with some pride about Muslim participation in the world wars that took place. And of course, any person who knows their history, any Muslim who knows his or her history would know this isn't something for a Muslim to be proud about. This isn't the world wars. If you think about World War I, what took place was that you had Muslims that came from India that participated with the British in World War I. But of course, the Muslims in that region were of course colonized by Britain at the time. So in one respect, they were coerced. They didn't have much of an option. But even if they weren't coerced, how can it be something that we're going to be proud about when in World War I, we know Britain fought on the opposite side of the Osmani Khilafah, which of course was Turkey. And so you had Muslims being pitted to fight against their fellow believers. And whilst they tell you one side of this narrative, they won't then tell you about the other side of the narrative, where some Muslims decided that once they found out that they were going to be pitted against their own Muslims, they decided that they did not want to fight and then rebelled against the British Army, who then killed and slaughtered those Muslims. And of course, we know that the Quranic narrative in relation to history, again, there's many historical events that's referred to in the Quran, and Allah discusses these issues for us to take benefit and lessons from. And if we look at Surah Yusuf, we know Allah Jalla wa Ala says in verse 3, نحن نقص عليك أحسن قصاص بما أوحينا إليك هذا القرآن وإن كنت من قبله لمن الغافلين. The meaning of which is that we narrate to you the best of narratives by revealing to you in this Quran, though before this you were certainly of those who did not know. And then Allah finishes that very same surah by saying لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَاصِهِمْ إِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, which says that in their history certainly is a lesson for men of understanding. So when we're discussing these historical issues, brothers, the main point isn't just for us to learn about, it's not stories that we're listening to here. The main and sole purpose should be for us to benefit from those. So coming now to the topic of today. Now the Straits of Gibraltar is one of the busiest shipping lanes even up to today, and many of the ships that pass to and from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean, there's many such voyages, and the passengers that are on these voyages will undoubtedly and inevitably see and notice a big gigantic mountain in Gibraltar. But of course, when we think about Gibraltar itself, we should ask ourselves, what does Gibraltar mean? Where does it derive its name from? And of course we know that Gibraltar is taken from the Arabic of Jabal al-Taariq, meaning the mountain of Taariq, Taariq ibn Ziyaad, of course. And we then need to ask ourselves a further question, which is, what was it that brought Taariq from the Muslim lands into the very heart of Europe? And today this very region or this country is still named after him. Now, there are a number of accounts relating to Taariq's ancestry, the most common of which is that he belonged to a tribe called the Banu Nafzal, which is a Berber tribe in North Africa. And it is said that Taariq and his father was a freed slave, and that they had embraced Islam from the very early times of the great Muslim commander Uqba ibn Nafi. And of course we know who Uqba ibn Nafi was if we think about the conquest, the great Muslim conquest. We know straight from the period of Abu Bakr and Umar, the Muslims had left the shores of the Arabian Peninsula and had started to spread this deen. And the great Sahabi Amr bin al-As was the one who opened up North Africa through Egypt. And it was Amr bin al-As who then sent his commander, Uqba ibn Nafi. And Uqba ibn Nafi, if you read, we're not going to go into too much details about this, but Uqba went right across the North Africa. One country after another he conquered. So Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and of course the furthest is Morocco, which was called the Maghrib. And they say Uqba continued to ride and conquer until he got to the furthest point at the end of Morocco, and he rode his horse into the sea, and he said the famous statement where he said, "Oh Allah, had it not been for this sea, I would have continued to gallop on my horse and continued to conquer these lands until they were all under your command." And so Europe can be thankful that Uqba was stopped by the sea, because of course Islam would have probably spread a lot sooner than it eventually did. And Taariq was, and again, just to place this all into the historical context at the time, so at this period you had the Umayyads were in power, and this was a great period of expansion for the Muslims. At this same time that Uqba ibn Nafi was going right across North Africa, you had another Muslim, again sent to another part of the world, who was Muhammad ibn Qasim, who was sent to the place of Sindh, which is modern day Pakistan. And of course that then opened up the lands of Asia to the Muslim Empire. And again, to briefly explain to you about Muhammad bin Qasim, just a very quick side point. If we remember from the seerah, we know that the year of grief of the Prophet ﷺ, part of this included an episode where he went to Taif. And of course we know the story where he was chased out by the people of Taif, and the blessed body of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ was bleeding, his head was bleeding. And we know that Jibreel alayhi salam was sent to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was told that, "Oh Muhammad, the angels of the mountains are at your command. If you wish, we will raise these mountains over the people, and that will be the end of Taif." And we know the Prophet ﷺ said that for that not to take place, because he believed that there may be believers from their progeny. And the Prophet ﷺ's foresight is such that, subhanAllah, when you think this Muhammad bin Qasim, who opened up the lands of Asia, India, Pakistan, today Bangladesh, was from this very region of Taif. And Taariq was a young teenager when he became a member of the Muslim army, and he showed great courage and enthusiasm and won the trust of the general of the area, who was under the command of Musa ibn Nusayd. Now Musa ibn Nusayd himself was, of course, Musa being the son of Nusayd, and Nusayd was again someone who was prominent in terms of, during the life of Khalid ibn Walid. We know that when Khalid was conquering Persia, one of the areas that he took during the battles of Ain al-Tamar, the people that he had conquered in that time was Musa's father, Nusayd, who was a Christian at the time. Of course, he then became Muslim, and of course Musa was a Muslim, of course. And so this gives you an indication how early in the period of Islam that this was all taking place. And the Khalif of the time of Walid ibn Abdul Malik, and so whilst this was what was happening in North Africa, I think we should take a shift. We pause for a moment here in Taariq's life, and we'll take a look at what was happening on the other side of the shores in the Iberian Peninsula that today you and I will refer to as Spain. Now the Iberian Peninsula at this point was being ruled by the Visigoths, or the Goths in short, who were Christian. They subscribed to Arianism. Arianism is a denomination of Christianity who they dispute the divinity of Isa alayhi salam to some extent. Anyway, they then accepted and embraced Catholicism, and during this period of the Gothic rule of the Iberian Peninsula, a number of councils took place. Now, the Gothic capital was a city called Toledo, and during this period a number of church councils took place, which we today know as being the Toledo councils. And again, you can search this up and look them up. And church councils usually take place where there are issues of concern to the Christian community. Now, also in the Iberian Peninsula at this time, you had a number of Jewish people there as well who belonged to the Sephardic Jews. And in these councils that were taking place by the Goths, they had one radical goal, which was to uproot Judaism from the Iberian Peninsula. And the third council that took place in 589, it was decreed that the children of mixed marriage between Jews and Christians, that the children would have to be Christian, and that Jewish people couldn't take up any positions of authority. Also during this period, so the successive councils that took place, many more restrictions were placed upon the Jewish community, and this included and impacted on their Sabbath, their dietary laws, their marriage laws, the circumcision of their young, until we get to the 17th Council, which took then place in the 694. And what was decided in this council was that the land of the Jewish people had to be forfeited by the state, and that any child over the age of 7 had to be forcibly converted to Christianity. And so, of course, it's clear that life for the Jewish people under the Visigoths was very grim and dire. And this then became even worse in 710 when King Roderick came to power. Now, it's said that when King Roderick came to power, that there was, some say it was a bit like a coup, and you could argue it was a bloody coup, not very bloody, but there was some disputes. But anyway, he took the reins and he took power in 710, and he continued this oppressive policy. But under his reign, not only did they continue to oppress the Jewish population, but he also oppressed his own Christian community as well. And an event took place during this period where the governor of a city called Quetta, which is in fact in the north of Morocco, and in fact still comes under Spanish rule, surprisingly. A governor there, a Christian governor called Julian, it is said that his daughter was dishonored by this King Roderick. And so Julian decided that he wanted to avenge this, and being not too far from the Muslims in North Africa, in Tangier, which is where Taariq and Musa ibn Nusayr were, he asked for help from the Muslims against this ruler of the Goths, King Roderick. And so Musa ibn Nusayr, at the behest of the Khalif Walid ibn Abdul Malik, had sent his commander Tarifa ibn Malik with Julian to go on a reconnaissance mission to the Iberian Peninsula, so that he can investigate, to look at the land, see what the landscape was, see what the situation was, to gather intelligence essentially. And Tarifa ibn Malik then landed in the place in Spain which today we still call Tarifa. It's after his name, Tarifa ibn Malik. This is who it's named after, and it's still named after him even today. And this was a successful mission, and he and Julian then go back and then feed back to Musa ibn Nusayr what they had seen. And so Musa now, again at the behest of the Khalif, decide that they are going to help Julian, and they are now going to invade the Iberian Peninsula. And to carry out this mission, he appoints his young commander Taariq ibn Ziyaad for this role. And they gather an army, it is said, of about 7,000 men. In some narrations it says 12,000 men. And it is said that Julian had in fact supplied the ships to the army of Taariq so that they could go across the shore, and the purpose of this would have been so that they were undetected by the Gothic army as they would have seen them coming from the sea. And the first point that the Muslims land, of course, is Gibraltar, which we said earlier takes its name from Taariq himself. And it was here that Taariq delivers one of the most famous battle speeches that we know of. And it is now referred to as the Khutbah of Taariq, and I will relate to the translation of this. So Taariq says to his army, "O my warriors, where will you flee? Behind you the sea, before you the enemy. By Allah, there is no salvation for you but in your courage and your patience. Consider your situation. You are in this land like an orphan cast upon the world. You will soon meet a powerful army surrounding you on all sides, like the infuriated billows of a violent sea, and sending against you countless warriors drowned in steel and provided with every store and description of arms. What can you oppose them with? You have no other weapon other than your swords. No provision except those that you snatch from the hands of your enemies. Banish all fear from your hearts. Trust that victory will be ours, and that barbarian king will not be able to withstand the shock of our arms. Do not think that I impose on you a task from which I shrink myself, or that I conceal from you the dangers attending this expedition. And do not imagine that while I speak to you, I mean not to act as I speak. For as my interest is greater in this, so will my behavior on this occasion surpass yours. For it is my intention on the meeting of the two hosts to attack the Christian tyrant Roderick and kill him with my own hands, insha'Allah. When you see me bearing against him, charge along with me. If I kill him, the victory is ours. If I am killed before I reach him, then do not trouble yourself over me, but fight as if I was still alive and among you, and follow up my purpose. If, however, I should be killed after inflicting death upon the king, then appoint a man from among you who unites both courage and experience, and may command you in this emergency and follow up success. If you follow up my instructions, we are sure of victory. And some narrations say, although it's not clear, some say that it's a made-up account, that Taariq had burnt the ships, the very same ships that transported the Muslims across the shores, that he had burnt these ships, and so there was no, and the psychological purpose of this would have been for the Muslims is that there's no return, there's only one direction. You either continue forward, or the sea is where you're going to retreat to. So there's only one choice really, if that was the case. And the battle then takes place, and this encourages the Muslims greatly. And again, some narrations although it's not clear, say that the Taariq was quite. Even if you read this khutbah, you see there's a lot of certainty in his speech, and they say that he had dreamt that the Prophet ﷺ had told him to march forward and that the Muslims would be victorious. And the battle then takes place in this, it's called the Battle of Guadalete, which is the river where it takes its name from. And it is said that the Julian and his men, which again they're Christian, that they also are with the Muslim army, and wherever the Muslim army are going, they act as guides, and also to warn the people that the Muslims are here not to invade or to attack you, but rather to actually liberate you. And again, as for the Spanish population, the Jewish population of the Iberian Peninsula, they were most certainly seen as saviors. The Muslims were certainly seen as saviors by them. And there's numerous accounts telling of the contributions of the Jews during these battles. And a Jewish historian, Nahum Shluch, says that the victorious Muslims in 711 were everywhere supported by the Jews, to whom the Muslims confided for safekeeping every city which they conquered. So what this Jewish historian is saying is that every city that the Muslims took, they then placed in place of command Jewish people to look after those cities while they continued the battle. Another historian, Gabriel Jackson, states that the Muslims were welcomed by a large proportion of the ruling aristocracy of the Jews. And again, in fact, some Jews, go as far as saying that Taariq himself was Jew, because he was, of course, seen as a liberator for them. Because again, if you go back to the Toledo councils that took place and the restrictions that were being placed on the Jewish community, it is without a certain of a doubt that Taariq would most certainly have been seen as a liberator for them. And what then follows after this is that, alhamdulillah, the Muslims conquer or liberate the lands of Iberian Peninsula, and they move up city after city, work their way all the way through. Spain, in fact, they even go further than that. Abdurrahman ibn Ghafiqi even goes and crosses into France as far as Tours or Poitiers, and then they are knocked back. And this is effectively how far the Muslims go. They stop at the northernmost point of Spain, which where Catalonia is, where the famous Barcelona team represent that particular region. So they go as far as that and leave it as that. As for Taariq, what then takes place, Taariq and his commander, Musa ibn Nusayr, are then recalled back to Damascus. And Taariq and Musa go back to Damascus with the spoils of the war. And what takes place then is a change in guard. So Walid ibn Abdul Malik, who was the Khalifa at the time, was approaching the end of his time, and he was very ill. And it is said that whilst Musa and Taariq were travelling back to Damascus, that news reaches them that Walid ibn Abdul Malik is about to die. Now, he had no heirs, and so the ruler who was going to be appointed was his brother Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik. And it is said that Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik wanted to ensure that this victory was under his reign. And so they say that he had asked Musa ibn Nusayr to delay bringing the spoils so that it could be under his account. And it is said that Musa decided not to do so and continued. And then when they do reach, eventually, they do reach whilst Walid ibn Abdul Malik was still alive, but soon afterwards he is dead, and Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik then takes the reins. And when he takes the reins, he of course has, you could argue, or we could say, a grudge against Musa ibn Nusayr and Taariq ibn Ziyaad for what they have done. And he then strips them of their duties, and we then know nothing really further of both of these individuals. Again, as a side point, in terms of Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik, he was of course the person when he dies, that he again had no children, or he had a very young child who couldn't take up the reins, and we know that through him, his cousin was then appointed. And his cousin was none other than Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. He was, of course, one of the greatest leaders that the Muslims had seen since the Rashidun, the time of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali radiallahu anhum. And this is the end of the life of Taariq, but of course there are many beneficial lessons for us to take from his life. Again, when we go back and we look at the situation of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, they were suffering from a pharaonic experience at the time, with their with restrictions being placed on their beliefs, practices, and of course their children being taken away from them, much like what Fir'aun did with Bani Israel. And so for them, of course, it goes without a shadow of a doubt that the Muslims were seen as liberators, which is why the supposition at the beginning, whether he was a conqueror or an invader or a liberator, I think many would argue, certainly from the Jewish community, it was certainly seen as a liberator. And of course, Taariq was of course invited by another Christian ruler to come in. And Taariq's battle speech itself gives us an indication in terms of the motivations of the Muslims at the time, because in his khutbah he refers to the barbaric and tyrant king. Now, this barbarism, tyranny that Taariq was referring to in his speech wasn't on an account of King Roderick's treatment of Muslims. King Roderick had no Muslims to be barbaric against or tyrannize or oppress. It was on account of his oppression of his people. And it shows again that the Muslims understood full well the Islamic narrative on the concept of oppression. And we know in the Hadith Qudsi, Allah says that, O my servants, I have made oppression haram on myself, and therefore for you as well. And we also see that again, relating this to a recent matter, you had a conference that took place in the UAE recently, and the whole alleged purpose of this conference conference, it was said that it was meant to be for purposes of peace, for an alliance of nobility, and many people were referencing this concert that took place during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, this Hilful Fudul. Again, I'm not going to go into details about this, but this was a treaty that the Prophet ﷺ had entered into before prophethood with a number of, again, they were obviously non-Muslims at the time, and the purpose of this was for a matter of social justice and to get together an alliance to deal with an oppression that took place about a particular individual. And the Prophet ﷺ, we know after prophethood, had said that if he were invited to this again, that he would certainly readily accept such an alliance. In other words, that he would ally himself, even if they were non-Muslims, that he would ally with them on matters of goodness and to stand up against oppression and tyranny. But of course, the irony of those that were trying to use the same concept for this conference that had taken place in the UAE, who are known, of course, for oppressing many Muslims. And if you look at the situation in Yemen today and the role of the UAE there, where 18 million Muslims, suffering from famine and close to death, that it flies against the face of to suggest that that's the nobility of alliance, or that's the same concept that the Prophet ﷺ was using. But if we think about what Taariq and the Muslims are doing there, this, you could say, is like the Hilf al-Fudul that the Prophet ﷺ was speaking about, where they were standing up for injustice, even if it was against non-Muslims. And again, just to briefly, if we think about the noble maxim of jihad itself, what we can learn from this again is that jihad can be used for the protection of not only Muslims, but also for the preservation and the assistance of non-Muslims as well, which is what this took place here. And in terms of the Taariq's life, I mean, we can also say that in terms of his race, some people say that Taariq was black-skinned. Again, there's no definitive view as to what his race was. What we do know for certain was that he was from the Berber tribe, and the Berbers we know right across North Africa and West Africa. So today, countries such as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Mali, Niger, Mauritania, all of these countries, you'd have Berbers from all of these countries, and therefore you'd have light-skinned Berbers as well as dark-skinned Berbers. But one thing we do know for sure, that many of the army of Taariq was certainly of darker skin. And the reason I say this is because in the famous French poem, the Song of Roland, which was written to depict the events that took place in Spain and then followed through into France, the poem refers to a number of the Muslims in a number of derogatory ways, and refers to racial connotations such as referring to their black skin, broad noses, and stated that they came from Abyssinia, which is now, of course, Ethiopia. And in terms of the legacy of Taariq, now, Taariq's age is something that we, some of the youth ourselves, can take lessons from. Now, it is said that Taariq's age, that Taariq was at 19, in some narrations it says he was 21. So if you think about this legacy, I mean, such a weighty responsibility on such young shoulders. And again, if you look at the legacy he left behind, so the Muslims entered Spain in 711, and the last Muslim rule ended in 1492. So that's 781 years that the Muslims ruled the Iberian Peninsula. And if you want to put that into perspective, if the Muslims took control of the Iberian Peninsula when they left, i.e. in 1492, then they would continue to rule until 2273. So that puts into perspective how long the Muslims remained in Spain. And it ushered in, which what many refer to, even in the West, as the Golden Age. Certainly, even for the Jewish community, if you read again for the Jewish community, this was seen as one of the Golden Age for the Jews as well. And there's much tolerance for Christians and Jews that lived under the Muslims in Spain as well. And again, Taariq, there's not much, as with many other Muslim generals and commanders, the likes of Khalid ibn Walid or Salahuddin, Nuruddin, and many others, Muhammad Fatih, and many of these other great luminaries and commanders that we had. With Taariq's life, there's actually not that much there. We don't seem to have much about his life before and much about his life afterwards. And it's as if Allah had only sent Taariq for this period of his life only, for this victory for the Muslims. And although some say that Taariq died in obscurity, i.e. we don't know much about where he is, where he died, the accounts of his death, one thing we do know for sure is that even after all these years, 1300 years later, Taariq's name continues to shine and remains tall and firm like the very rock that continues to bear his name. Jazakumullahu khairan. I'm not a scholar, so I don't know the Shari'i reasons for this, but what I can say is that yes, it would have certainly played into the Muslims' hands. Some even say that the Muslims were in fact, maybe even if Julian hadn't invited the Muslims, it's likely that the Muslims probably would have still gone across at some point anyway. But what we do know, the point being is that the point that they did go, they went at the behest and invitation of the people there themselves. And we also know, and again, these are Western historians, non-Muslim historians, who attest to the fact that many of the people openly embraced Islam because of the tolerance of the Muslims. And so there was no forced conversions or anything like this. And again, some narrations also say that there's the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about the prophecy at the time concerning Constantinople or Istanbul, which is now known as Istanbul, of course. And the Prophet ﷺ had prophesied that the Muslims would conquer this land, and he speaks very favourably about the commander who's going to be granted this victory and his army. And some say that the Muslims were actually, in fact, going across the Iberian Peninsula with a view to going around so that they could eventually conquer Constantinople. So that was also in the minds of the Muslims as well. Allah is best. The Muslims put Spain on the map. Spain's history, there is Spain even up to now. The glory years of Spain is during the Muslim rule. If it wasn't for the Muslims in Spain, Europe wouldn't be where it is today. Europe at this time, they refer to it as the Dark Ages. You might have heard this notion about the Dark Ages. Well, it may have been the Dark Ages for the West, but it was certainly not Dark Ages for the Muslims. And whilst Europe as a whole contained probably a dozen libraries, you had hundreds of libraries in just some of these cities itself, in Cordoba or Seville, for example, hundreds of libraries. And in terms of the agriculture and some of the technologies that they were employing, the Muslims, this kicked off what the West referred to as the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is the period where you could argue it's almost a transfer of knowledge from the Muslims to the West. So the Muslims taught. You had today many Muslims and people from all over the world, non-Muslims alike, travel to Britain or maybe America to go and study in the likes of Harvard or Oxford and Cambridge. During this period, you had people travelling from all across the world to go and study in Spain under the Muslims. This was the centre of learning, this was the centre of innovation, and so, yes, it transformed the life for the Spanish there indelibly, completely, yes. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.